organizations know more than they do. They're quite literally leaving money on the table. They were able to cut their cycle times from 120 days now to 10 days. By the following September, they were one of the biggest COVID testing labs in the country. It was just a remarkable pivot. By starting fewer things, you'll actually get more done.
This is Nelson Repenning, an MIT professor who spent 30 years solving a problem most organizations don't even know they have. His method helped the Broad Institute pivot from gene sequencing to becoming one of America's largest COVID testing facilities in just 6 months. But his most counterintuitive finding challenges everything we think we know about productivity. Here's how organizations are sabotaging their own success and the simple fix that could change everything.
Well, Nelson, it's such a great honor and pleasure to have you here today on the show. You are an iconic figure, a master of efficiency, and we all know it here at MIT Sloan. But for those folks who may not know, perhaps you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, my name is Nelson Repenning. I'm a professor here at the MIT Sloan School of Management. I am an MIT lifer. I showed up on my 23rd birthday as a graduate student expecting to be here for 4 or 5 years, and that was more than 30 years ago. And my specialty is really organizational change and what I call implementation, which is when an organization identifies a new tool or technology or process that they want to use, what are the best ways to implement that in the organization so that they actually get the value that it might have to offer.
And now you have this new book out, right? So I feel very privileged. This is just fresh out of the oven, it feels like. So you wrote it with your collaborator and partner, Don Kiefer. So tell us maybe a little bit about him and why you decided to write this book after many, many years.
Great. So let me give you the origin story, or origin myth, as the case may be at this point. So when I was a grad student here, again, now many years ago, it was the era when the quality management tools, largely driven by the dominance then of Asian manufacturers, Toyota and Honda, were really the hot topic. So people were talking about lean production and total quality management and Six Sigma and so on. And most of my fellow grad students and the faculty that I was working with were working on developing new tools. So new algorithms, new statistical methods, new decision support kinds of activities. And frankly, I wasn't sure I could compete. It seemed like all my fellow doctoral students knew more math than I did, and just wasn't sure that I was going to be able to make a contribution. And I kind of randomly happened upon a question that has turned out to be somewhat heretical, which is, do people actually use these new tools that we're spending so much time developing? And with a little dig into the literature, what you quickly discovered is the answer was, at best, occasionally, and very often, not at all. And that question has really dominated my life ever since, which is, the basic phenomenon is organizations know more than they do, meaning that they often have access to tools and processes that have been demonstrated to create value, and yet often do not use them. And so they're quite literally leaving money on the table, which is an interesting question both from a scholarly point of view, but also very important for practitioners. And so that's really what I've been working on. And very early in my PhD career, the National Science Foundation offered a grant program, which at the time was novel in the sense that you had to have industry partners in order to apply for this grant. And Harley-Davidson signed up as one of the companies that we were working with. And where I met Don is I was walking down the hallway in the Harley corporate office one day with my contact who was the head of quality management, and Don was walking the other way, and Ron, the guy I was with, said, "Oh, you really got to meet this guy Kiefer. He's shaking things up around here." And we ended up having lunch together, and it turned out we had a real shared fascination and a sort of obsession with how do you make organizations work better. And we've really been working together ever since. And I think, the magic of our tag team is he is a dyed-in-the-wool practitioner. His career started on the shop floor, running metal cutting equipment, worked his way through every job, up to the sort of executive suite. And I've never had an honest, job in my entire life. I've been an academic the whole time. And so hopefully what happens is theory and practice come together. And we have been working over the course of our careers on trying to come up with methods that make organizations work better, that real managers can use and actually work. And that really was the genesis of the book that he and I just completed together.
That's amazing. And then you mentioned theory and practice, right? The perfect marriage. But MIT is really about not just theory and principles, but really getting into the nitty-gritty impact, right? So you've actually had a number of results with dynamic work design, DuPont Chemical one, and the Broad Institute around here in Boston being another one. Can you share maybe some real, world examples of how this can actually be implemented and what kind of impact it's had?
Yeah, we were incredibly fortunate that our lead users for dynamic work design were, as you mentioned, the Broad Institute. They grew out of the Human Genome Project. It's a joint institute between MIT and Harvard and a bunch of local area hospitals. And Sheila Dodge, who was a member of our inaugural EMBA class, one of the programs that you're also a graduate of, didn't really say much during her 2 years. She was a very diligent note taker and kept her head down. But in the last week, she made a presentation. She said, I've just been promoted, and I have this big organizational challenge of melding these different groups, and we're falling behind our competitors. And literally, as she was walking out the door, I said, I have a couple colleagues I think that might be able to help you. And from there, Don and I started working with them regularly, and these are some of the smartest people in the world in terms of they're molecular biologists and computational scientists. And Don and I didn't know anything about gene sequencing, and frankly still only have the most limited understanding of it. But as it turns out, they were running a factory. Samples would come in one side, and data that would go back to the researchers would come out to the others. And this was something that we knew a little bit about. And so we've worked closely with them for more than 10 years, and the results have really been phenomenal. They were able to cut their cycle times from 120 days now to 10 days. They have probably quadrupled the productivity of their R&D or technology development platform. Just huge improvements on every dimension of their opportunities. And we certainly have learned as much from them as they have learned from us. They have been fabulous partners. And then I think the most interesting twist of this is that, great operational improvements over the course of 10 years, very impressive. It's described in detail in the book. But as we were developing these methods, there was an interesting controversy that kind of emerged, first on the theory side, but it has practical implications, which is many scholars in my field have long argued that if you do process improvement too much, it has the side effect of kind of hardening the organizational arteries, meaning that if you get really good at making buggy whips, you're not going to be able to adapt to making cars or something like that. I've never really believed that. Because I feel like process improvement actually creates skills and capabilities that then can be applied to new activities. But it's been an open question. In the spring of 2020, when COVID hit, Broad does most of their work with universities. And so in March, they were shutting down the lab because they figured that they'd have to wait it out because universities weren't doing work. And that all changed on one day. They got a phone call in the morning that said, do you all know how to do COVID testing? We are woefully under capacity in Boston. We can't even test the staff in our hospitals, let alone patients. Could you figure this out? And they sat down and thought about it. They said, actually, COVID testing isn't that different from gene sequencing. And in fact, if you take the hard parts of gene sequencing away, what you're left with is a COVID test. And so in about 3 weeks, started doing a couple hundred tests a day. This is in March. By the following September, they were one of the biggest COVID testing labs in the country. I mean, it was just a remarkable pivot or transition from one business to the other. Obviously, they worked enormously hard. They're very smart people, but I think dynamic work design really provided the foundation. And so it tested, my side of this argument in a way that I could never have imagined, with really stunning results.
So I'm just kind of thinking from the point of view of a person that's affiliated with an organization like that. But how do they actually tackle dynamic work design or implement it? Do they reach out to you first? What's kind of the protocol?
So there's a couple answers to that question. One of the things that I think Don and I were enormously lucky is a couple years into the EMBA program, we had a hole in our schedule for the summer class because faculty don't like to teach in the summer, of course. And so we took over a class that was called Organizations Lab, or OLAB as it's known. And we started teaching dynamic work design in its early incarnations. This was about 10 years ago. And I think the thing that we didn't appreciate is this proved to be a fabulous engine to generate new projects and test new hypotheses every year. And so the EMBA students were a really important part of helping us make this better. And the students have done some incredible projects ever since. So one way students get started is they take our class. We also have an exec ed version that's 2 days. And we've had some great projects out of that. But I think the other thing that happens, the people that we've had the best luck with sort of share Don's and my early sense that, the title of the book is There's Got to Be a Better Way. And often I think lots of people in organizations share that sense that they're frustrated with what's happening. And there's an interesting wrinkle here, which is I think almost everyone that works in a company of midsize or larger has experienced fleeting moments of greatness, right? They've either had a team that really worked well or their organization responded to a crisis. And so they know there's a better alternative, but they just can't quite figure out how to put it into play. And when we meet people like that, right, we can usually give them a couple tools or a few simple ideas, and then they're off and running. And those have been some of our most successful projects. I hope now that people will read the book, and that will, give them a little bit more clear set of steps to use some of these tools.
With the frameworks, yeah, indeed. Now going to the book, in terms of how it makes you more efficient, it's really about kind of cutting through chaos and firefighting, right? How do you exactly do that when compared to traditional methods?
Yeah, so let me answer that in two ways. I think the first thing is my early work, and probably the first 10 or 15 years of my career, was all about why that chaos and that firefighting exists. And the basic diagnosis there boils down to, it turns out human beings have a hard time learning the right lesson in organizations. And take a very simple example. If I own a factory and I have a bunch of maintenance mechanics that fix my machines every day, if I fire those maintenance mechanics and they quit doing maintenance, in the short run, my results look better. Maintenance is expensive, it takes time away from productive machines, and if I send all those people out the door in the first quarter, or maybe even in the first year, my numbers look fabulous, right? And human beings are very good at learning when there's a situation where I take an action, I get a quick outcome, right? I fire my mechanics, things get better right away. I learn very quickly that's the case. In the long run, of course, right, if I don't maintain my equipment, my factory is going to, decline, and we're going to have quality problems and so on. But that only happens with a delay, and so it's much less likely that we'll put those two things together. So the core reason behind why organizations sort of fall into firefighting and chaos is that very often we learn exactly the wrong lessons. The things that we do that make things better in the short run actually tend to make things worse in the long run. And this is exactly the reason that we all have a hard time resisting that cake or the extra cookie at the end of the day, right? That sugar tastes good, but then we're making some sort of marginal erosion in our health in the long run. So that's kind of why it happens. The traditional methods, what most organizations do when they find themselves kind of in this mess, is they kick off a big change initiative. As Don and I often joke, they have t-shirts and coffee mugs, and you have a 2-day offsite at the local hotel, and you bring in a fancy consultant. And the kind of implicit model that underlies that is that we're going to fix everything at once. Okay? The problem with that is that most organizations don't have the opportunity to just quit doing work for 3 or 6 months while they change everything. It's the metaphor they have to keep flying the plane while they're rebuilding or whatever. And it just doesn't work because usually the change initiative adds additional work on top of what is already a busy schedule. And so most major change initiatives do not succeed and in fact tend to breed cynicism and disenfranchise people along the way. So in dynamic work design, what we tell people to do is exactly the opposite, which is don't try to change everything at once. Find one's problem, and you probably remember from OLAB, and take that problem and scope it down to a specific manifestation where you can run a fast experiment and learn quickly where you're headed in the right direction. And if that works, and you put a few points on the board, then go on to the next one and the next one. So we preach a very incremental mindset. And it turns out that has a lot of desirable properties, right? One is it doesn't overload you with 50 new things that you need to do. Two, that even when you solve a very small problem, you often learn a lot about the larger scope of the organization, so it makes it much easier to go do the next change and the next change. And we've also learned, I'm not sure we anticipated this in advance, that even if you solve a small problem, if you really solve it, it generates results that makes it much easier to convince people for the next round of changes. So that sort of start small and change every day rather than do big change initiatives, we've had very good luck with over the years.
Like a ripple butterfly effect kind of a
exactly
thing.
Right.
Yeah. And you have 5 principles in your book. So can you share them what they are? And then also, which are the ones that leaders often tend to overlook or miss, and why?
Yeah, great question. And I would say just to motivate the principles, what we're really looking for is to create work systems that in the long run are self-diagnostic, meaning that the work itself will tell you what is the next problem you need to solve, right? When you get started with dynamic work design, you often have to look for the problem to solve. But in the long run, what we hope happens is the work is configured so that the next thing you need to work on as a leader is immediately apparent, which just makes your life easier. So with that setup, the 5 principles are solve the right problem and solve the problem right, which basically boils down to when you have a problem that has not yielded to sort of the traditional approaches, we want you to be a good scientist. Don't just rely on your instincts, formulate a clear problem statement, go collect the data, do a good investigation, run an explicit experiment, and then evaluate that experiment. And this is not new. It's embodied in many of the process improvement efforts like Six Sigma or lean production. But our experience is everyone needs a reminder is use the methods that you learned in 6th grade science class when you're confronting a difficult issue. Number 2 is what we call structure for discovery. And basically the idea there is to try to configure the work so that people have the best chance of learning the right lessons. One of the things that we've discovered through our work is that the work that people do, and I alluded to this a few minutes ago, often teaches people exactly the wrong lessons about how the work is done. And this has a couple core elements, which is make sure people actually understand the targets that they're after, make sure they get clear feedback about whether they're meeting those targets or not. Both of those are pretty commonplace. And then the third one, which I think people are less clear on, is be explicit about your choice of the activities that you're going to use to meet those targets, right? In most cases, when I ask people, what are you going to do to meet that target? They say, well, I'm just going to show up and work. That's what I do every day. But often that comes from the unconscious parts of our brains. And when we get people to just write down or put on Post-its, okay, what are we actually going to do to meet those targets? Often they like, wow, I had no idea what we do, or I didn't realize that we were still doing these activities. So just adding a little bit of deliberation helps a lot. Third one is what we call connect the human chain. And the easiest way of describing that, and there's a lot of nuance in this one, is meetings or face-to-face interaction are one of the most powerful and also most expensive ways that we have of getting work done, right? If we go to a meeting with 10 people, that's 10 hours of work that's not getting done for the organization. And so we want to put that face-to-face communication in the right places in the process of getting the work done. And it turns out what face-to-face communication is really good for is processing ambiguity, dealing with uncertain situations. And if you want the more practical version of that is if you go to a meeting and you're not either solving a problem or making a decision, you really need to ask yourself whether that is a useful meeting. And so that principle is all about putting that expensive but valuable interactions in the right places. Fourth one is what we call regulate the flow, which is make sure you have the right amount of work in the system. And then the fifth one is visual management. And the basic idea with visual management is for knowledge work, which is what the overwhelming majority of workers do nowadays, there's no shop floor, right? I can't go watch the motorcycles roll down I can't go watch research being done in the way that I could watch a moving assembly line in a factory. And so what visual management about is basically capturing the workflow for knowledge work in some kind of simple visual representation. Now, pre-COVID, we were particularly enamored with a very low-tech solution, which was whiteboards and markers and Post-it notes. You draw a picture of the process on the board, put the projects on Post-its, and then put them up on the board. Nowadays, there's fancy digital tools, but they do sort of roughly the same thing. To your question about where leaders really struggle, I think there's challenges in all of them, but the biggest pain point, and I think therefore the biggest opportunity to make things work better, is in that fourth principle, regulate the flow, which basically boils down to most organizations have much more work in them than they could ever do, and as a consequence, their activity sets really look like a highway on Friday afternoon, right? If you maximize the number of cars on a highway, the flow grinds to a halt, and that's what happens in many, many organizations. They start too much work and then nothing gets done. And it leads to it's probably the most counterintuitive thing in dynamic work design, which is it's very hard for leaders to get their heads around. By starting fewer things, you'll actually get more done, right? And that's very counterintuitive, except that we all know this in other facets of our lives, right? I can fly down the highway when there's no traffic there, but on Friday afternoon it grinds to a halt. But we have seen it's just really hard for leaders to do that. And in part, it's because all the projects that they want to do are good projects, right? And so cutting back on work means saying no to good ideas. But if you don't, what you're going to end up with is that big traffic jam and nothing will get done.
Interesting. Yes, yes. That's actually something that I had to hear. But moving along, so I think not a day goes by when we don't hear about AI, even in organizations. But how do you think AI can actually complement or augment, your work, or potentially be a risk factor?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and as I'm sure you know, at MIT you can't walk 2 feet without hearing AI-enabled something or other. And I've lately been using an analogy to think about this, that there is no question in my mind that AI is going to radically change all our lives. I think the only question is which organizations are going to be able to implement it more effectively than others and get the competitive advantage that comes with that. And the analogy that I find helpful is we've been through this before in a following sense, which is in the 1980s, automation and robots in factories were really a big deal. And the then CEO of General Motors stood up in the mid-1980s and said, the way that we're going to compete with Toyota and Honda is we're going to have lights out factories, right? We're going to automate everything. We're not going to need those pesky human workers anymore. And we're going to be more efficient and our cost basis is going to be lower and so on. So they were trying to do automation all at once. Right? And it was a total disaster. The robots sometimes welded the car doors shut, sometimes they painted each other rather than the cars. The GM facilities that had all this automation never reached the same levels of productivity and cost effectiveness that the traditional factories that had 2 human beings had. Now, interesting wrinkle, go to a factory today, automation is everywhere, right? So GM had the right idea, right? Automation was going to change the way we manufactured things. It is a question of implementation, right? How did you get from point A to point B? And I think this is a really good example of where the all-at-once strategy does not work. And I think something simpler is going to happen with AI. Again, there's no question that it's going to change probably almost everything we do. But I think the organizations that try to go too fast and do it everywhere are really going to struggle for a very specific reason, which is most processes, knowledge work processes, and the same thing was true for manufacturing in the 1980s, are a mix of the formal process, right? That's what senior leaders think is happening. And then all the little workarounds that the people doing the work have had to add in order to get the work done, right? It could be adding an extra step, or maybe I knock on your cube and say, hey, how do you do this, right? Every process is a mix of the way it was originally designed and then a bunch of little changes that we make in order to get the work done. When you try to implement AI all at once, no one is going to be cognizant of all those little changes, and so you're going to run the risk of intervening in a complex process that you don't understand, particularly if you try to change everything at once. So what I think is likely to be a much more effective strategy is to, as we talk a lot in the book, understand how the work is actually done, right? And then use AI to solve specific problems in that process, right? AI is really great, for example, when you have extremely repetitive work that still requires a high degree of fidelity, right? I need to look at that scan, and I need to find that little anomaly every single time, because if I don't, something goes wrong. Fabulous application. And you could think of many others, particularly when work is repetitive and boring. So I think if you run small experiments, like let's try AI here, you're going to learn a lot about how your organization works. You're going to learn a lot about how AI interacts with the organization. And then once you get it working there, you can move on to the next problem and the next problem. So I think that incremental strategy is going to work far better, particularly for large organizations in the long run. And again, 20 or 30 years from now, if we have this conversation again, of course, there's going to be AI everywhere. But I think the companies that do well are going to be a little more thoughtful about how they get from point A to point B.
Mm-mm. So this is, I guess, an extension of what you're saying. But what I really kind of liked about a phrase that you use a lot is that these problems are usually a design problem and not a people's problem, which is actually quite counterintuitive, because I feel like people always think it's an HR problem, right? Like it's humans just not liking each other or not just being able to work with each other. So that was interesting. But how do you think we can design the workflow or the system so that AI takes care of high fidelity things like you mentioned, and the humans thrive in what we do best, like creativity, empathy, and maybe judgment, right?
Yeah, I think there's probably 2 things that are required. First, as you point out, we have a very strong propensity, this is a deeply seated psychological feature of the way the human brain works, is we tend to blame the person closest to the problem for the problem, not that underlying design. And it creates this sort of very curious sort of dichotomy, which is in the physical world, we are very comfortable with the idea that if something doesn't work, it might be the design of that thing that's causing it. So, a couple years ago, some people may remember Samsung had this line of phones that if you sat on it, it would catch on fire, right? Nobody blamed the user for that, right? It was a flaw in the design of the phone, and if you sat on it, it would flex just enough, two things would touch, and it would short out, catch on fire, right? That was clearly a design problem. And yet, if I have a R&D environment that's not working well or a project that's behind, right, when we're dealing with people, our instinct is to say, oh, it must be the project manager's fault, rather than we have somehow configured this organization so that no normal person could be successful. So I think the first shift, and this is another hard one for managers, is they have to get their head around that probably the things that they find most frustrating are as much to do with how the organization is configured as the individual personality or attributes of the individual in there. And again, that's hard for us because it's just not how our brains interact. And then I think the second piece is, to your point about where to put it, is we really need to understand how the work is actually done. So as you may recall, when I had you in class, one of the exercises we asked people to do is once they have formulated the problem they want to solve, they have to go see the work. Right? So they have to follow how that work moves through the organization and watch that problem that they're trying to solve actually happen. And as the students are walking out the door, in fact, the current class is doing this assignment right now as we speak, we always tell them that when you go see the work, if you're not embarrassed by what you find, you're just not looking closely enough. And what that is supposed to capture is once people kind of get into more senior management roles, they often have no idea how the work is actually done in their organization, right? They are not familiar with all those little workarounds, metaphorically speaking, the duct tape and chewing gum and, safety pins that people are using to sort of knit a process together so the work actually gets completed. And to sort of repeat my point from earlier, if you try to automate that whole process with AI without understanding how the work is actually done, I think you're running a really grave risk. And so I think once you understand the work, right, and really understand how it's actually done, I think in most cases it'll be pretty clear where sort of surgical or strategic applications of AI will make the work better. And to give you another analogy from manufacturing, in the early days of automation, what Toyota did is the first places they used automation where either the work was dangerous, right, because it was heavy, or it required, again, a degree of fidelity where I needed to do this thing exactly the same way and it wasn't something that was conducive to humans. I think the same thing will be true with AI. And then you're exactly right. The result will be the work that remains is stuff where humans, I think, thrive more because it's more creative or we need, again, empathy or something like that. So I think understanding the work will reveal several years worth of opportunities to make things work better.
Interesting. Well, Nelson, it's been a pleasure today. Thank you so much for making us all more efficient. And I will go and delve into this book and become an efficiency guru myself. But it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me.